What's been the result of Australia accepting this model? Well, in material terms, we have become more prosperous. The surveys show no happier, of course, but we have become more prosperous. But some, of course, have become much more prosperous than others. Researchers from the University of Oxford and the Australian National University have shown that in 1992, the salary of a typical executive of an Australian top 50 company was 27 times that of the average worker. 27 times. But 10 years later, in 2002, it was 98 times larger. In 2006, according to the World Wealth Report, 160,000 Australians had investable assets, that is, assets not including their principal residence, worth over $1 million. 1,200 of them had investable assets of 30 million or more. The wealthiest 200 in Australia in 2006 saw their total wealth rise by a massive 26.7% that year to about $130 billion in total, mainly through the resources boom and shareholdings. That amount is enough to fund the entire Australian defence budget for 6 years. The top 200 individuals had an estimated average worth of more than $600 million each. Yet this winter, Mission Australia estimated that almost 100,000 Australians have no place to call home. Of those people, almost 50% were under 25 and 10,000 were children aged under 12. And globally, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that 852 million people are going hungry, unable to avoid sufficient food to meet their daily nutritional requirements. Free market theory isn't feeding them. And if they should, for example, decide that the West is corrupt, as Al-Qaeda says it is, and subsequently supported terrorist organisations, who would we blame? Not ourselves, I fear, because we are also quite dangerously greedy and sure of our own moral integrity. The most dangerous myths in any society are the ones that nobody questions. In Australia, faith in the redeeming power of the market has become the great myth of our times, a happy fantasy of financial magicians and providers who take credit for the successes but never are to blame for the losses. How did we come to believe in the ideology peddled by free market utopians? I think the reason's fairly simple: rising house prices. When your home is rising in value by 20, 50 or even 100% a year, it's hard not to feel relaxed and comfortable. Never mind that that feeling is largely illusory, as anything you buy will cost the same inflated value as anything you sell if you purchase in the same market. The share market boom, which has only tanked in recent times, also contributed, with 45% of Australians now shareholders. Think of it, almost half the country hanging nightly on Alan Kohler's every word. Like the plague, greed is contagious, and with the rich on a bender and feeling pretty affluent ourselves, we began to ape the rich, spending up on home renovations, restaurants, and our version of foreign aid, the overseas holiday. Then came the gadgets. Throughout history, technology has been a vector and accelerator of human greed. It's been both creative and destructive. Take nuclear weapons, for example. But technological innovation is an indispensable part of our culture. The new industrial revolution in China helped foster our delusion of wealth by providing a flood of once costly white goods and electronic appliances and gadgets at unbelievably low prices. We stopped going to church and started worshipping at Bingley and Harvey Norman. Low interest rates provided further encouragement, if any were needed, to fuel the firestorm of greed and consumerism sweeping across the sunburnt plains. In poor societies like India, where I've spent a lot of time, the lower orders are either completely downtrodden or they engage in a vigorous debate about fairness and equity. But in situations of plenty, both paucity and excess become more abstract concepts. Greed is no longer a zero-sum game. There's less concern with what constitutes a fair share. Everyone has more than enough to eat and play with, so who cares if some individuals eat more than they need to or have better toys? In short, we believed because we wanted to believe and could afford to believe, at least for a little while. And remember, the collapse of Marxism-Leninism eliminated any real debate about whether our new wealth was either desirable or sustainable. Market theory is based on the idea that the general good is best served by everyone pursuing his or her own self-interest. And in many ways that makes sense. The theory's most influential exponents, people like Adam Smith and Milton Friedman, made no secret of their belief that any social benefit that derived from entrepreneurial endeavour was purely accidental. They believed what they called the invisible hand of the free market would always produce the most efficient outcomes. And this is supposed to be an economic theory, by the way, not some weird religious cult. Trust in the invisible hand to lead the way. Free market theory's simplicity makes it popular among people who think in slogans and who have an interest in the rest of us doing likewise. But try to implement the theory fully in practice and the result is social chaos and economic collapse. If you're a market fundamentalist, the first thing you want to do is abolish the aged pension and replace it with a self-funded retirement investment package that can go down the tube in the next stock market correction. Unemployment benefits would have to go as well. They're for lazy sods who think it's beneath their dignity to work for McDonald's. And foreign aid, that's a scam. Money for nothing for useless foreigners who can't be trusted anyway. Defence Force? Who needs it? The invisible hand will make everybody rich enough to have a McDonald's in their town, and as everybody knows, wherever there is a McDonald's, people there immediately lose their appetite for war. Now, these things are not sort of fantasies dreamed up by me. These are the sorts of things you read in the Australian every day. The market is touted as an economic cure-all. When times are good, it's all thanks to our knights in capitalist armour. When things go bad, it's always the government's fault, or the unions are to blame, or the infernal regulators, or something called market failure. A nice, clean, consequence-free term. Milton Friedman saw no need for a minimum wage or even licensing procedures for doctors. The patients of the good doctors would live. The patients of the bad doctors would die. The market would weed out the bad doctors. Would any of us run a family like this? Perhaps apply the user pays principle to the children's clothes? I don't think so. Ask the victims of a property trust collapse, many of whom will have lost their retirement savings, what they think of the invisible hand. When a shonky company like Firepower collapses, it's not the market that steps in to correct things and provide justice for the people who've been conned and had their money stolen. It's the legal system, and then only in a very, I suppose, belated and inadequate manner. Even Thomas Hobbes, whose Leviathan is a cornerstone of Western philosophy, and who defined greed as the driving force in modern society, warned that the benefits of pursuing self-interest can only be realised if they are reconciled with other people's self-interest. Elements in our modern public discourse lack such wisdom. We have in some respects gone backwards since the 17th century. But the fact is, fortunately, that Australia is not and has never been a land where free market theory has been implemented fully, because unrestrained greed will destroy any society that liberates it. Like all other Western developed economies, Australia believes in vigorous government intervention to ameliorate the nasty aspects of capitalism and it is this intervention that is principally responsible for allowing the system to survive. Most Australians today are beginning to feel the chill winds of economic slowdown. The end of the real estate boom in Sydney and Melbourne was a body blow to confidence. The share market boom was good for those with cash to invest, but as the markets have become increasingly volatile, mum and dad investors have begun to hide under the couch when Alan Kohler comes on the television. Superannuation sounded like a good idea until you found out that it meant putting your retirement savings into a casino called the stock market. All 50 of the top super funds actually lost money last year. In 2003, at about the same time that house prices stalled, the first oil shock of the 21st century began eating into household budgets, diverting spending on services and retail products to the dinosaur graveyard of fossil fuels, robbing the economy of vital impetus. And this, 30 years after the first oil shocks in the 1970s, gave us all the warning of what was likely to happen. All that was left was cheap money at low interest, and then interest rates began rising. Add to that rising inflation the enormous government expenditures diverted from social spending towards military and security measures post 9/11, and the subprime credit crisis, and there seems very little prospect of the good times returning any soon. Locked down in our mortgages on our overvalued houses, which cannot realise their value, hypnotised by broadband internet and cable television, we find that the same technology and investments that liberated us have also pacified and enslaved us, and made it easier for those who are still trying to squeeze an extra bit of juice out of the lemon to claim more productivity gains out of fewer and fewer employees. And the same technology allows them to outsource work to India, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, if we dare resist. As many of Australia's super rich have become even richer, philanthropy has gained great prominence. Yet, when you explore how much Australia's wealthy actually give, again, the answer is little. It's called the wealth effect, and what it means is that the more you get, the more you want, and the less you give. Earlier this year, the Queensland University of Technology's Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies published a study by two of its senior research fellows called Good Times in Philanthropy, Giving by Australia's Affluent. It painted a disturbing picture in which wealthy Australians donate less than 0.5% of their income to charity. They found that 40% of Australia's richest people probably give little or nothing. Say what you will about America, but wealthy Americans, as a percentage of their income, donate 8 times more than their Australian counterparts. The occasional exemplary figure like Clive Palmer aside, Australia's rich simply are not pulling their weight. Australia's new rich, in general, have yet to learn the habit of expansive philanthropy that exists in older nations. Good Aussies all, they still seem to think that they're the underdogs, oppressed by governments and the taxman. True pessimists, squirreling it away for that tourist excursion to the moon or a rainy day sometime next century. 8 years ago, at the height of the boom, Anne Summers, and I didn't realise that Anne would be on the podium when I included this quote, wrote, "This should be a time when the rich are creating public legacies, in the arts, for instance, as so many American plutocrats did when F. Scott Fitzgerald was writing, and funding endowments to create opportunities for the majority who are finding times tough." Well, it's been 8 years now, and I suggest we stop waiting and start clawing back some of the resources we need to solve the problems of our society. And the question is, how? There are two dangers in any discussion of greed. First, that it ends up being an exercise in finger-pointing motivated by envy. Second, that it illustrates the problem without suggesting any solutions. My solutions are a few, and they're for discussion more than anything else. But first and foremost, I would suggest we need better leadership. I would welcome the day when an Australian Prime Minister can stand before the public and pledge that within a single parliamentary term, his aim would be to reduce the level, or her aim would be to reduce the level of income inequality in Australia. I think it's an aim that is important for the future of our society. I'd also like to see a government white paper on Australia's mineral and energy resources focused on how their exploitation on the current model serves our national interests and how they might be better utilised in future, in particular in softening the adjustments that we are going to need to make in order to cope with climate change. Thirdly, equity in the tax system needs to be restored. The accumulation of incredible wealth by a tiny minority of Australians in recent years, much of it generated from the sale of our mineral resources, will result in the emergence in the coming decades of a new class of super-rich Australians. How do other countries in the world deal with this problem? Well, Great Britain's had probate in various forms since the late 1600s. And in the United States, estates valued at more than $2 million, or $4 million for couples, attract federal estate tax at a top rate of around 55%. That's discounted if the owner of the estate has made charitable donations. Some of the strongest supporters of these estate levies, called death duties in Australia until they were abolished in the early 1980s, some of them have come from the conservative side of politics and still do. Winston Churchill called them a certain corrective against the development of a race of idle rich. And some of America's wealthiest men, including Warren Buffett and William Gates Sr., father of Bill Gates, are strong supporters. Just last year, The Economist, a British magazine whose economic rationalist credentials are impeccable, declared its support in the following terms. A thriving economy will generate great fortunes, but there is good reason to check these becoming entrenched through inheritance. The estate tax offers a modest counterweight against the development of a new plutocracy to rival the industrial barons of America's Gilded Age. Furthermore, it also taxes wealth built up through windfalls rather than thrift and effort. For example, recent gains in the housing market have accrued mainly to people who happen to belong to the right generation and who own property in the right places. Bill Gates Sr., author of Wealth and Our Commonwealth, Why America Should Tax Accumulated Fortunes, says the wealthy owe a special debt to societies that have fostered their enterprise. Most of the things that have generated the enormous advances in the American economy, he says, started out on some campus or in some laboratory. And most of those are because the government financed it. Says Gates Sr., without the tax, the wealth of the privileged few could grow to a point where they have too much control over the national agenda. I would argue they already do. Australia's, as I said, had a form of that particular tax until the 1980s, when it was abolished by Queensland. And other states followed because they feared an exodus of retirees to the Sunshine State if they didn't. Of course, the exodus happened anyway. In the United States, only 2% of all estates attract this tax. In Britain, it's about 6%. By allowing the recently departed rich to hand pass their dizzying wealth tax-free to their offspring, Australian governments place a heavier than necessary tax burden on middle and working people. The Secretary of the Treasury, Ken Henry, is currently in the process of reviewing Australia's tax system. Business has, as usual, been making a lot of noise, lobbying for their sectional interests. But in the interests of the rest of us, I hope Mr Henry is at least considering the problem of untaxed inherited wealth. If he isn't, one would have to ask, given the influential support that exists, given the example everywhere around the world of it working, one would have to ask, why? As I hinted earlier, if you talk about greed and don't include yourself, you're not going to have much credibility. Like most Australians, I'm a very patchy giver. My generosity is occasionally triggered by media coverage of natural disasters and special appeals, or I might, for some particular reason, donate a portion of royalties from a book for a worthy cause. With most of us no longer regular churchgoers, we don't have that little nudge provided by the plate going around in the middle of Mass. If we're going to change this, we need simply to develop a habit of giving. Government can do more. In Hungary, they've launched a scheme that allows taxpayers to allocate a percentage of their income tax to specified non-government organisations and charities. We could try that here or something similar. But we can't wait for governments or philanthropists to act. We need to lift our own game if we're to make a difference, and it would make an enormous difference to those charities who serve this country. If we were to even give 1% of our income, it won't buy hero status, but it is 3 times more than your average Australian who gives, and twice as much in percentage terms as Australia's richest people give. It might be a way to feel better about ourselves, to feel more engaged in our own society, to feel that we would do something, even if we're so busy doing other things that we don't actually contribute with physical effort. As a self-employed person for at least 10 years, otherwise known as a BAS or Business Activity Statement slave, I'm getting ready to file my tax return for 2007-8, and when the numbers are crunched, I will be writing a cheque for that 1% of my taxable income, and I'll be doing it for the rest of my working life. And I challenge Alan Moss to do the same. By my calculation, that's at least $300,000 from you, Alan, for last year. Actually, I suspect that Mr. Moss is already giving more than everyone in this room combined. I would urge all of you and anyone else listening to or reading this lecture to step up to the mark. And for what it's worth, yesterday I arranged for a kind of honour roll to be put up on my website. You can email a pledge through the website if you wish, and hopefully it might make a difference. And just to be clear here, I'm only looking for pledges which you're responsible for filling. Do not send me any money, unless you really want to. To conclude, when Roger Federer walked onto the centre court at Wimbledon to seek a 6th consecutive men's singles title this year, he was not being greedy. Rather, he was trying to be the best that he could be in his chosen profession in life. It is not wrong to excel. But had Federer arrived to claim the title by right, regardless of the negative impact that would have had on world tennis, based on the theory that because he had won it 5 times already, he must always win, then he would rightly have been laughed off centre court. Acknowledging the fact that we are all, to some extent, greedy should not deter us from doing what philosophers and politicians have been doing since time immemorial, by calling greed by its true name, not celebrating it. Australia has a problem with greed. We need to recognise it. We need to claim responsibility. We need to own it. Crushing initiative is never the solution. We should encourage it, but also guide it in directions that benefit the largest number of Australians. Because it's not really greed that ails us, but a particular kind of greed that destroys. Greed for the wrong things. If we were more like Federer and less like Macbeth, we might develop a Zen concentration on excellence, self-improvement, making ourselves as good as we can be, exemplary citizens of a just society, and expect rewards only if our efforts made us the best. We would define success in more than purely financial terms. Enterprise benefits society and should be rewarded, but so too does generosity. Not to mention thrift, loyalty, engagement, cooperation, hard work, regardless of one's job, and many other qualities which too often in today's Australia are utterly thankless. As times get tougher and we confront the limits of greed as a guiding principle for our lives and country, I would hope that a new awareness of those rather old-fashioned virtues, but still quite sturdy, spreads. Perhaps future Australian governments and corporate philanthropists will join us in this endeavour. If they don't, you would wonder what kind of country they want to be rich in. Thank you very much for your attention.